Also with us is Christopher Poulos, Executive Director of the Washington State Reentry Council. He's appeared with us on an earlier conversation that we had. I'm glad to have him back. I think this is an area that he can actually, along with Carmen, give us some personal experience in things that they've dealt with and being involved in the criminal justice system. And finally, Jeffrey Robinson, ACLU Deputy Legal Director and Director of the Trone Center for Justice and Equality. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and thank you all for joining us. And I'm going to start with you, Jeff. When we talk about what has happened over the past year, and I think there's, again, as I mentioned, this reckoning of what's happening regarding race in America today. But the truth is, systemic racism it has a long history in just about every institution in America, and especially, as I mentioned, in the criminal justice system. Why is it that locking people up is such an American thing, and maybe locking people up for a long period of time, and people, and especially with an onus on people of color, so horrendous in America as versus elsewhere in the world? You need to mute yourself. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here, especially with all of these panelists, and thank you, Enrique, for kind of bringing us together. And the history is a very long history. It goes back to American colonial days, and it has to do with the criminalization of Black people's attempts at freedom. So back in and just give me a second. Back in colonial days, there were laws, for example, that said that if an enslaved woman had a child, that child was also enslaved. Why would they need those laws? Because white men were raping Black women on a regular basis, and the law wanted to be clear. Not only would those white men not be arrested or prosecuted, but if those children came out with blue eyes or freckles, don't go thinking it's a human being. It's an enslaved person. There were laws that said if an enslaved person resisted a master and was killed while resisting a master, the master hasn't committed a felony. That's not a law on the books in any state in America. But go back 10 years, look at the number of Black people unarmed that have been killed by police in America. Then look at the number of police officers that have been charged with anything. Then look at the number of police officers that have been convicted of anything. That law isn't on the books, but it is still in effect. These laws in colonial days were then endorsed in the Constitution. Article 4 of the Constitution made it clear, if you are held to service and labor and you escape, you must be returned upon demand. People didn't want to use the word slave or enslaved, so they used other terms, but everyone knew exactly what it meant. And what that means is that in the document that formed our country, Black attempts at freedom were illegal. So the police have always had a role at preventing Black attempts at freedom through what evolved into a criminal legal system. And just to bring us up to today, the Civil War ended, and then what happened? Black codes, Jim Crow laws, and who do you think enforced those laws? Mr. Plessy in Plessy versus Ferguson and Rosa Parks in the bus boycott got arrested because the police were enforcing those Jim Crow laws. The final thing I'll say is Chicago 1919. You can go and look at the report. The National ACLU has actually done a short video on these. Chicago 1919, Harlem 1935, Detroit 1967, and Los Angeles 1992. Uprisings where someone in the Black community was injured or killed, there's violence, police respond, and there's a report. Those reports are saying exactly the same thing for the last 102 years. So that's the foundation that provides the answer to why is there such an animosity between law enforcement and the Black community? Why is there such disparity, not just in the state of Washington, but across the country? Because it was designed that way and it was executed that way. And only by realizing that will we start to think about ways to change it.
Also want to mention to those of you that are joining us this evening that if you have a question that you want to submit, you can do so through our Q&A box, and we would definitely want to work in your question later so we talk to our panel members, but please, we want to hear from you. Well, Catherine Beckett, you, in the study that you did, which I guess what struck you most in doing that study? Because we know that issues regarding sentencing and long sentences that people of color tend to get hit the hardest. But I guess tell me about the study and what kind of the highlights and things that stuck out for you the most.
Thank you. I mean, as Jeff just made very clear, the issue of racial inequality and the role of the criminal legal system and policing in maintaining it is not new. But I think what is new is the scale of the thing. So we've never had this many people living their life behind bars ever in history. And we're doing this kind of crazy experiment in a way that no other country has done. So the racial inequity of it is not new, but the scale of it is new. And I think a lot of people in Washington state think, oh, well, we're different here in Washington state. We're more progressive and enlightened than in other parts of the country. And it's true that if you compare our incarceration rate with many other states, we look better. You know, we're on the lower end compared to, I think, 40 other states or so. However, if you look at the rest of the world, we're still an outlier. I mean, it's only because the states have moved so far on this issue that Washington state can look at first glance, if you're only referencing other US states, to be kind of more moderate. But the truth is our incarceration rate is something like 4.5 times higher than that of Canada, just our neighbor to the north. So I think it's important to dispel the idea that this is not an issue in Washington state, and racial inequalities are as great or greater also in Washington state. Of course, it looks a little different when you have such a large white population, but the degree of inequity is actually as great or greater in Washington than in the rest of the country. So I think that's number one. And then I think the other thing that's a little bit, it's true of some states, and I would put Washington in this category, is the main driver of mass incarceration in Washington state is the growth of long and life sentences. That's not true everywhere. If you go to states like Oklahoma or Louisiana, you find that, but you also find a lot of people serving time for low-level offenses, drug offenses, and so forth. We have fewer of those folks, and what we have instead are more people serving time for violent crimes than is true in other states. And we've decided that the appropriate policy response to that is to impose longer and longer sentences, including many more life sentences. So we now have a situation where something like more than 1 in 6 Washington state prisoners is serving a life sentence. More than 40% are serving sentences of 10 years or more. So this is a real problem in so many ways, you know, ethically, in terms of the aging of the prison population, in terms of the damage done to families. And I think there's a real challenge here because addressing this requires that we talk about the problem of violence and what else we can be doing about it. So I guess I'd start with that.
All right. Well, Carmen, let me turn to you. You were in the criminal justice system. You had some tough times in your life, and I guess from your own experience and from the work that you're doing now, what concerns you the most about mass incarceration and particularly how we handle it?
Well, I think one of the things that really sticks out to me is that once you're caught up in the justice system or the criminal legal system, because it truly isn't one of justice, right? It's one of violence and coercion, but But once you're stuck in those cycles of recidivism, it's really hard to break free from that. That means, if you come in contact with law enforcement, it's more than likely you're going to be arrested, even if it's for something as simple as jaywalking. For me, I cycled in and out of the justice system between the ages of 12 and 33, initially in the juvenile justice system, and graduating at 18 into the adult justice system with a possession charge. And the way that it just holds on to you, it makes it hard for you to integrate into society. There's no safe spaces. You're already otherized, you're stereotyped, you're labeled as an individual who should not have access to jobs, should not have access to housing. All of those things that we traditionally take for granted are something that people who have been in the criminal legal system have to fight for each and every day. So I think that that's what sticks out to me the most. And with my own personal experience and working now within the system and trying to build equity, I think the overlying theme that I see is that when you're trying to drive equity, whether it's racial equity or equity across the board, there's such blind spots within the criminal legal system. They know we can show them the data all day, yet they refuse to enact any kind of mitigating policy, or what they create is just as punitive. Their assessments or bail reform, everything always comes down to still layering punitive measures upon punitive measures to keep people of color in jail. And I think I shared this earlier with us when we met prior to this, that as many of us community advocates and reentry specialists work to get people out of the jails and prisons across the state because of COVID, locally here in Spokane, we had over about a 3-week period, we had almost 400 people released. And a judge whom I work with on our Law and Justice Council, she did a walkthrough and she said that she was just shooken by who was left behind: Black, Indigenous, and non-English speakers. Those individuals, because of the criminalization of Blackness, because of the dehumanization of BIPOC communities, they could just leave them behind without a thought as to their value of life, their humanity. And that's something that just really kind of sticks with me, and something that many of us work aggressively to push back against.
Well, Christopher Poulos, you're one of those people that also works on this as well, and you know this well because you were in the system. And the fact is that I was reading your story today, and you talked about having a defense attorney that was ready to basically have you go to jail right away, and then because you were able to get someone else, but that you also knew that in doing so that you had you had some privilege there that others don't have, just what Carmen was talking about. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so that particular story, I actually just want to start by just noting that today is the National Day of Empathy, where we're working together across the country to break down these stereotypes that people either fit into the category of victim or person causing harm, and that in fact we are all human beings in this. So anyways, I've been part of that in person in the past years and just wanted to mention it today. But my work in this space actually began when I was sitting in county jail before I went to federal prison. I ultimately did go to federal prison for a multiple year sentence. But when I was sitting in county jail and my court appointed attorney told me There's no way you're getting out. You're facing 5 federal felony charges, drug charges, a gun charge. There's no way you're getting out. You might as well get the clock ticking on your sentence now in county jail, is what he said. This was our first conversation. We didn't even have the discovery. We didn't know what the evidence was against me. We just knew the charges. And I hung up with this guy and I said, I felt like this is how I felt. I felt like there's this conveyor belt towards incarceration, and the prosecutor is one player in this factory of mass incarceration. My counsel in this situation was another player. The judge is a player. All the bail bonds people, all of them are just players in this system. And I'm just on the belt, riding along. Even with my whiteness, I was still on the belt. And I was able to hire private counsel in this particular situation. And I don't even know what they had for dinner in jail that night, because about 2 hours later, I was walking out the front door. And what the lawyer, the new lawyer that I got, he called the U.S. attorney and said, look, this guy has no money to flee with. He's not facing any actual violent charges. He's got a job in the community. He's got strong ties in the community. He's already in recovery from addiction, and any criminal conduct has already ceased. Why not let him out to work and prepare for the case and save up some money? And the assistant U.S. attorney actually just said, fine. And they said, fine. And so the huge difference, and actually the pivotal moment where I became determined to become an attorney someday and fight these laws and this injustice, was the fact that I was in recovery and that I had my wits about me and I was not in that active, because I was carrying a gun and selling cocaine at one point in my life. I had stepped out of that. I had been lifted out of that before I got indicted on 5 federal felony charges. And what happened was, while I was leaving jail that night, strictly because of, in this case, my financial privilege, I felt sick to my stomach. I felt actually physically nauseous that I was leaving all of those folks behind, mostly Black, brown, or lower income white folks behind. And that was the moment I became determined that this would be my life's work. And it has been since.
We'll talk more about that. Jeff, I want to come back to you in that I'm sure you've heard these stories before numerous times, particularly as a defense attorney. And but it seems like the American system, and Catherine, I'll have you weigh in on this as well. The mass incarceration or incarceration, just throw the book at folks, is a very American thing. Am I right?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is, just listening to Chris and Carmen, anyone who has the idea that somebody who violated the law, even in a serious way, has to be defined by that violation, you just saw 2 of the most beautiful examples you can see. And let me just say, as a 34-year criminal defense lawyer, the story Chris told about his counsel made me want to throw up. And I guarantee you that his story is not unique. And it's not always whether you have money or not, it's who your appointed counsel is. And his whole image of the conveyor belt was just so powerful. So I'm sorry, I just had to say that.
No, that's fine.
But bring me back to the point you wanted to cover about extreme sentences. The thing that has made me the most curious is a guy named Anton Breviac. I may be mispronouncing his last name, but I think it's Breievak. He's from Norway. He killed 77 people, many of them teenagers. When he was sentenced, the news agencies in Norway said, this is the worst act of terror since World War II. And when he was sentenced, this is just several years ago, he was sentenced to the maximum sentence in Norway, 21 years. Now, if he had been in America, he would either have had a needle in his arm, or he would be serving about 1,000 years in prison. So what's the difference? What makes Norway look at an horrific act like that and say, we are going to punish you severely? Here's 21 years. You can't say they don't care about their citizens or the people that live there as much as America. Their healthcare is better, their schools are better, their criminal legal system is better, their social programs are better. So it ain't that they don't care about life. What is it that makes them look at that act and say 21 years? And I believe, and I think others that I have read believe, that a large part of it is that Norway has never othered a significant part of their population. They have never taken that part of the population and considered them or treated them as less than human. And so I think that the point that Catherine Beckett made earlier about we have to look at violent crime in a different way if we are going to deal with mass incarceration. Just how long do people need to stay in? And our theory has always been crush them. Look at the horror that they did and hit them back as hard as possible. It is literally revenge. And so I think that's something that we have to deal with before we can start understanding why our prison system looks this way.
Catherine, can you pick up on that, particularly with the work that you've been doing? Why do we seem to, have these long sentences? Now, obviously, I mean, some people commit crimes that I think they probably deserve the sentences they get. But I guess tell me what you think is overkill.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess I may not take a position on that, but I would just emphasize, along with what Jeff said, is, the US, and actually it's really not Norway that requires explanation, because Norway's more normal than we are. Only 20% of the world's countries allow for LWOP sentences, life without the possibility of parole. Only 20% of the world's countries even allow for them, and most that allow for them don't actually impose them, or if they do, it's just very, very rare. So we are, everybody knows we're an outlier with the death penalty, but we're also an outlier with life and long sentences. And I think, it started really in the 80s and into the 90s. There was this almost like an arms race of, you can sort of see, well, 3 strikes, no, 2 strikes. And our sense of what was normal and what was required for justice really just shifted dramatically in that time. It surprises everyone to hear that up until the 1980s, prior to the 1980s, in Washington state, a person convicted of murder was almost certainly not going to spend more than 20 years, and often spent 13 with earned time for homicide, right? And so we look at that and we're like, oh, that's not normal, but that was the norm. And what's happened is we've had this inflationary process. And I think those policies made a lot of sense, because what we know is that people do mature and transform even when they're confined in really horrific and in prison conditions that are in violation of human rights standards and so forth. People still mature and stabilize and become safe to release even after committing horrendous crimes often. And so I think what we've built is a policy system that doesn't reflect that at all. The last thing that I would just add, I think this is something that Chris had mentioned, is we know, children aren't born violent, right? Things go wrong, and the social world produces conditions that encourage violence in the contemporary United States. And so rather than talking about what those things are and how we could address those social conditions, and engage in prevention and better support children and families and all of those kinds of things, we just ignore kids in crisis. And ignore all the inequalities and ignore the school conditions and all those things that we should be addressing. And then once people commit the crime that lands them a long sentence, we sort of throw the book at them. And at that point, the state has all the resources it needs. And I think that that's a really glaring inequity that needs to be addressed.
Well, Carmen, let me come to you, because I think in your story, that's sort of what happened to you in some respects, particularly going into the juvenile system and being, I think, were you in foster care and other types of things?
Yes.
You make the point earlier about what you get in the system, getting out of it is just one hell of a thing.
Yes, and that's so true. Yeah, I came in as a foster child, removed from my home because of severe abuse. I mean, that was all that I knew, right? And going into the foster care system and then being shuffled from home to home to home, juvenile, simply because I was a ward of the court. They were able to do that. If they didn't have a home to place me in, they would put me in detention. And I took every opportunity that I could to run away, and I didn't feel safe, in these foster homes. I didn't know these people. I was often treated differently, and sequestered to a tiny room, refrigerators padlocked, doors locked from the inside. And these are just, traditional foster homes. So I wasn't going to stay there. And of course, you live out on the streets, you're a child, you get sucked into exploitation, drugs, just everything else that comes along with, being a child, and, um, you know, uh, what is out there for people who end up on the streets. And we know approximately 75 or 70% of foster children who age out of the system end up homeless and on the streets and in survival mode, and vulnerable to exploitation. For me, I think about, what Catherine had said about the causation. Why are people acting out in violence? If you look at the scarcity and the violence that we're subject to every single day, it's no wonder that people are acting out. I use an example. I fell into, after my third child, I fell into postpartum depression and then psychosis. And in that state of psychosis, I was at risk of harming my children because I was experiencing such a high level of, intrusive thoughts that were telling me what to do. And thankfully, I had, some semblance of, sanity to call 911 on myself. But look at the women across the country who don't have that, and then they do, murder their children or harm their children, and then they're going to prison for years. And you can see that our legal system does not protect women who have murdered their abusers, murdered their pimps, men who have been perpetrators of violence on children, sexual assault, sexual abuse, even murder. They're doing like 8 years, so you see the hierarchy of who is supported in this country. And it's typically white males, those are the ones that are getting away with the crimes and lower sentencing. And, women aren't. And we are the ones that have to then, try to raise men, and normalize the violence that we experienced. And how do you do that?
Right.
The cycles of violence continue and continue.
I want to move over to Chris. One of the things that you are very involved in right now is just helping people through reentry. The challenge there now, particularly if someone has had this long sentence and then they come out and trying to adjust to society again, I would think that it would be daunting.
Definitely. And, our position is that we've really got to have a holistic approach to reentry that starts with, preventing people from even getting involved with the system, the criminal legal system in the first place. But then, if we find ourselves in the situation where we're in under the mass incarceration system, then, what are we doing? Are we warehousing people and compounding trauma while people are incarcerated, or are we seeking to address the root issues during the incarceration? And we find that in a lot of cases, it is the first. It's people being warehoused, kept, and under control, but with oftentimes very little that's actually going to help people break out of those harmful cycles and be able to succeed afterwards. And this may be another question you were going to ask me. I'm not sure, so forgive me if I jumped the gun. But something I wanted to mention was, when this is the with George Floyd and the semi-recent attention on or rejuvenation of attention on racial justice and racial equity we've seen in the last year. And the focus largely, I've seen every company from Facebook to Google to, I'm sure Ford has one, right, about their race equity statements. And the focus is almost entirely on policing. And that's vital but insufficient, if that makes sense. We absolutely do need to ban chokeholds and have police officers trained better, but that alone will not dismantle this system. And so that brings us back to reentry, to sentencing reform, to investing in vulnerable and harmed communities and making amends and atoning to harmed people, way earlier in people's lives. And then finally, to actually changing our system of mass incarceration entirely. And there is a lot going on right now in Washington. I was super encouraged to see the state legislature not only focusing on policing, because some of the people who just got into this space are really focused on policing. And again, that's essential, but not sufficient.
Thank you actually for setting that up for me, because actually I want to come back to Jeff. Jeff, we talked earlier in the week, and we talked about the words defund the police. And, I will say that I find that a bad slogan, but anyway, only because I think some people take that and they freak out about it. But in this whole conversation of what we're talking about, it has a place. I want you to just talk a bit about that, okay, when we talk about that issue and the way it is now, and the issues regarding racial justice and inequities and policing, as well as our criminal justice system, how do we make progress?
I want to start where Chris left off, the kind of necessary but not sufficient, because that is that is literally the point. You cannot police and prosecute and imprison your way out of the problems we have in America. We have tried that for literally more than a century, and look where it has brought us. And so when you talk about spending more money on police departments, I just think that we have to start looking at the evidence. I want to read you the programs that Minneapolis police went through before George Floyd was killed. Procedural justice training, implicit bias training, mindfulness training, de-escalation training. They had a ban on warrior-style policing. They had early intervention to identify problematic officers who were being too violent, mental health crisis intervention training, and training on reconciliation efforts in communities of color, and that officer still knelt on his neck for all of America to see. We have to come to a realization that something's not working. And I want to make clear the impact of what has happened in the last year. It's incredible, but don't go thinking that this last year is unique, like America's never been here before. This is the thing that's unique. The cameras that make our stories of police brutality, not just stories, but videos. Now it's not just those Black people complaining about it, it's videos. If you send police officers to circumstances where people are saying, my child is having a mental health crisis, he's threatening to kill himself, and then the police kill him when they arrive, no sane society would continue that. No sane society would allow that. And so when you hear defund the police, I will say this. I understand that slogans are important, and some people say, oh, that's bad. And so I'm just going to turn my attention away from that. I'm not even going to consider that. Well, they've also been turning their attention away from the slaughter that's going on in the Black community for decades, if not more than a century. So I really don't want to hear anything about the slogan makes me turn away from it. If you're going to turn away from this issue that easily, it's because you really don't care enough. And what I will say is this: when's the last time that anybody looked at their local police department budget? Because back in 2017, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, the New York City police budget for 1 year, $4.9 billion. Minneapolis, $163 million. Oakland, California, $242 million. If you're wondering why we don't have money for the things that Carmen and Christopher are talking about, take a look at those budgets. Nobody is talking about getting rid of the police, but the police don't stop crime. The police respond to crime.
We have quite a few questions from folks that are joining us this evening, and let me share one with you, and I'd like to get a response from folks. How did the 3 strikes you are out law affect the incarcerated population compared to the populations without such laws? Who would like to jump on that one? Jeff, do you want to take that up first?
I just think if you go around the country, you can see that there are examples of people serving life sentences because, their 3rd strike was a felony shoplift, or their 3rd strike was a purse snatch, or their 3rd strike was some kind of drug offense. And it simply makes no sense. And it's essentially saying we are willing to completely throw your life away if you make a mistake 3 times. And so I think that's, Catherine has talked about it. Carmen and Christopher has talked about it. It is the values that underlie the system that make us think. It's this macho thing of, if we're really tough, then crime will go away. And I don't know, if you've tried something for more than a century and it hasn't worked, somebody might think maybe we should try something different.
Catherine, could you weigh in on this question as well?
Sure. I mean, I can talk a little bit about how Washington state compares. So not all states have 3 strikes laws. Washington does. Some of them are sort of have fueled the incarceration system more than Washington's. Like in California, virtually anything could be the 3 strike. There was a guy that I think stole a DVD or something, a VHS tape or something, and someone else who literally stole cookies, and that was their 3rd strike. In Washington, it was more narrow than that. It did have to be a violent felony offense, but that did include assault 2 and assault 1 and robbery 2 and robbery 1. So I would say it wasn't the most aggressive of the 3 strikes laws, but it definitely still had an impact. And there are hundreds at least of people in Washington state serving LWOP as a result of a 3 strikes conviction.
So, Christopher, I wanted to ask you, what is the biggest challenge for someone that's trying to re-enter today?
So I always like to say that successful reentry occurs when internal healing and growth are met with external opportunity. And I used to take about a half an hour to say that. I'd say, you need housing, you need employment, you need treatment, you need to go, family needs to be centered. And all of that is true. And I can certainly break that down into detail. But what it really comes down to is, first, speaking for myself and for many others, if I was still in the same mindset of when I was carrying a gun and selling cocaine and actively using drugs, and you threw me into an apartment and got me a job, speaking just for myself, I can't honestly say that would have been sustainable. On the other hand, if somebody has had this, great internal healing and growth, right? Maybe while they were incarcerated, they got in with a solid group of people and had some positive experiences somehow in that horrible situation, but then come out and can't rent an apartment, can't secure housing, can't get a job, can't get a meaningful wage career that's going to support their family and help lift themselves and their family and out of poverty. then even with that great internal awakening, it's also a recipe for failure. The number one external barrier we see is housing. It's safe and stable housing. As far as a concrete external need, landlords have every right legally, sadly, at least in this state, outside of Seattle, to say no based on any kind of criminal record that they come up with or comes back. We've been working on that. Seattle does have the strongest ordinance protecting people with past convictions in the entire country, and the sky has not fallen. We have not seen, record numbers of trouble with tenants, and so we are pushing for a statewide law. We're hoping to become the first state in the country to truly tackle rental housing discrimination against people with records. And so that's the top one. There are multiple ways to go after that. It would actually be less expensive if we had to just fund subsidized ongoing housing than it would be to have people experiencing unsheltered homelessness and then oftentimes ending up back in jail or prison or losing their lives.
Yeah.
And potentially harming themselves or others in the process. So again, it's that internal healing and growth met with external opportunity, but the top barrier right now that we see is safe and stable housing, because all else is dependent on that.
Yeah, Carmen, do you want to add on with your experience in your work?
Yes, definitely. I love what Chris said, that internal healing, often hard to do and challenging to do while you're incarcerated. Again, a system of violence, a system of oppression and harm, but people do come out of it, okay, sometimes carrying a lot of trauma and still with a lot of work to do. The reentry program that I have, focuses, we have a housing fund where we can, work with landlords, try to get people off the streets and into safe and stable housing. We can pay up to 3 months rent, and we know that's not enough, but in that 3 months, we can work with them and, help them build job skills. We have a job training program. We have a life skills program, all met with humanity and dignity and, allowing them to space to process what has happened to them, connecting them with community, pouring into them. We just had a family, both parents, justice involved, got custody of their 3-year-old child, still homeless. Within the last 2 weeks, we were able to get them into housing and literally furnish their whole house, TV, just everything that they needed that they didn't have. And, through that love and that community care is something that we don't always experience, right? And so they're going to turn around. They're getting trained right now to be peer navigators. And once they're trained, they're going to be able to go back into the system and work with people that are currently in there and hopefully build out a ripple effect, right? Where we're getting to the upstream folks, the second generation, the children, so they're not generationally entering into the system as well.
Right. Catherine, here's a question for you. The person that wrote this says that you mentioned that violence is an issue in Washington state. Any evidence of decision makers in the justice system showing bias toward BIPOC as being more violent? Are they charged excessively, over sentenced, seen as more threatening? And if so, what are the ways to mitigate that?
That's a really, really good question. And it's a really hard thing to study. So from like a research perspective, it's a hard question to answer. And the reason for that is that prosecutorial decision-making about like what to charge someone with, whether to charge and what to charge with, it sort of happens behind the screen and no one else can go there. And so we researchers have a really hard time digging into all that and getting the records we would need to be able to speak to that. What's easier for us to study, and so this is where most of us do focus our attention, is on the sentencing piece of it, and that's because those records are more publicly available. And yes, we do see some evidence of bias in sentencing across the board. I would say it's more pronounced. Like the less serious the offense, the greater the room for discrimination and bias, if that makes sense. But it definitely happens for more serious offenses as well. And then I guess the other thing to keep in mind is just the charges themselves. The way the law is written itself can have racially unequal consequences. So So for just to give one example, one of the 14 factors that differentiates aggravated murder from non-aggravated murder is whether the shooting took place in or from a vehicle. I mean, it's clear, like, why is that morally more objectionable than from a house or a sidewalk? It totally unclear to me what the answer to that question is, but it seems pretty clear that it has racial implications. So I think the law itself kind of has ways of building in racial inequity to it in certain cases.
Yeah. Jeff, I want you to take on this question. Do you think the police guilds and correction officer unions work to keep people in jails and prisons for their job security?
I hesitate to say what someone else is thinking when I haven't met them and I haven't talked to them. What I can say is this: police unions are one of the most aggressive forces in America at maintaining the status quo in the criminal legal system. They are aggressive in protecting their officers despite incredibly bad behavior. They are aggressive in terms of, I think the Seattle Times has published reports about the kind of money that some officers are making, and I think people were probably very surprised about that. But for me, the most important thing is officer discipline and the kind of protective shield that police unions have in terms of going to the legislature and saying, don't change the law so that we actually have to have a reason to shoot somebody. Let it be in our discretion, because that would be too serious. It would damage the ability for us to do our job. And this is where the issue of narrative comes in. The narrative that has lived for so long in America is that these streets are just so incredibly violent and so dangerous that you've got to have police officers out there doing whatever they have to do in order to survive. And if that means violating people's rights, if that means roughing people up, then that's what it means. And I would just ask folks to think about this. The stop and frisk programs that people may have heard of. And when I say stop and frisk, I don't mean police officers stopping a car because the lights are out and it's weaving on the road. I mean stopping people for no reason whatsoever. New York City, Philadelphia, every city that has done this. The numbers are almost identical. Somewhere around 75% of the people that are stopped are doing nothing. They're not breaking the law. They don't have any drugs or guns. They're doing nothing. You can't stop crime by harassing innocent people. So we have to change the narrative on what policing is about to, I think, start to back away from where we are and to make rational, common sense choices about how we go forward. Let me say this one last thing. Catherine talked about having to deal with, Dr. Beckett talked about having to deal with violent crime, and she is so right. The FBI will tell you that in the last 5 to 6 years, the number of people arrested for violent crime is less than 15% of all the arrests in America. So what do you do with that?
Good question. Let me ask you this. We've got about 4 minutes left before we need to wrap things up. And we've had a lot of good questions here, and we'll make sure the panel gets those so that you can maybe respond to some of these folks. Is there progress being made at all in trying to deal with, the concerns about, the mass incarceration in the United States today, and in particular, the inequities that we see? What can you point to? Catherine? Or Dr. Beckett, excuse me.
Catherine, I was afraid you were going to ask me. I guess a little, yes. I mean, the incarceration rate has dropped a little bit. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of 15% nationally. That was kind of pre-COVID. We'll see what happens with this more recent little dip. I think that certainly with respect to drug policy, there's greater recognition of the need for change. And, you know, we see some manifestation of that, like marijuana legalization and around the country, and now Oregon, and there's a similar bill pending, well, was pending, I think, in Washington, we'll see. But I mean, I think we're starting to see drug recognition of the importance of drug change. Where I, and this is kind of why I focus on violence, is I think that's the harder conversation that we're not seeing traction on. I think the other area that is, at least there's increased awareness. I don't know if there's a lot of great responses yet, but I think there's increased awareness of the need to do a lot better with folks with mental illness and other behavioral health issues in terms of kind of the front door of the system. And I think that one of the positive effects of the remobilization of Black Lives Matter this summer was it did have the effect of calling attention to the need to think differently, to build up other systems that can better address behavioral health issues. Right now, we're like the only option folks have when people are in crisis is call 911. And I think that at least there's growing recognition that that is not working well, and we need to figure some other things out.
Yeah. I want to give each of you just a short time before we close out here to give a closing comment. Carmen, how about you?
I would like to, propose that in shifting the narrative, that we don't look at who do we lock up and why do we lock them up. We look at alternatives to incarceration. We look at community-based organizations that are out there, have the relationships with the communities and can work in prevention. We look at building up, alternatives to policing that I don't know who said it, that we have no other reason but to call police, I'm not even talking about co-deployed teams. I'm talking about teams of individuals, organizations, trusted messengers, community health workers, social workers, deploy them, train them, group, put them in, crisis response and let them serve the community as opposed to law enforcement. I think that we'll have better outcomes and that we can actually build, just and thriving communities.
Chris,
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great thoughts, and I'm just really honored to be part of this group with everyone. And I think, if we're trimming around the edges of mass incarceration quite a bit, which again is, I keep saying this, necessary but not sufficient. Community needs to be fully aware of what's going on inside of our jails and prisons beyond what they see on shows like Lock Up Raw or what they see on Cops or what they hear. Both the good and bad. They need to see the groups of men and women who are doing amazing things under incredibly hard circumstances that's totally different than Lock Up Raw. And they also need to see the terrible harms that really do happen. I think every judge, every defense attorney, every prosecutor should have to go into our prisons and jails regularly. I can't imagine being, teaching about sailing and never going out on a boat. That to me, that's so foreign. And as far as what's happening now, there is, I'm not going to try to pitch a particular bill right now, but there is a bill in the Washington State legislature, 1282, which would double earned release time. So that's substantial. I would consider that more than trimming around the edges. And there, under the current bill, no one is excluded. This would be for all convictions, going from 15% good time to I think 30 or 33% good time. So there's a lot of examples of that. That's the one I'll give that may actually have legs. We'll see.
All right. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. I love what both Carmen and Chris said there. Just want to echo their thoughts. And then just kind of reiterate, I guess this was kind of the theme that Carmen was talking about. I think the defund, slogan has been critiqued, et cetera. Some people paraphrase it as divest, invest. And I think with that is creating. And I think that's really important work that needs to be done. If we want to build toward a society where prisons and police are not necessary, we have a lot of work to do in terms of building up other entities, other systems that can provide care and support for people who are struggling with addiction or mental health issues, or and as well as addressing poverty and all those related problems. And I think there's a lot of room for creative energy and ideas and work in building up those alternatives. A lot of community groups are already doing fantastic work, so we don't have to reinvent the wheel on everything, but I think some combination of supporting the work that's happening and building up new and creative responses to some of these complex problems is really also a helpful way of thinking about moving away from mass incarceration.
Jeff, the last word.
I really think that we have been through a global event with the pandemic, and with the murder of George Floyd and the other things that happened in the last year, when America was literally a captive audience. We didn't have the NBA on TNT to take our attention away. And so America had to have what William Burroughs called a naked lunch moment. He defined naked lunch as that moment when everyone has to look at what is really on the end of their fork. And what we have seen, it's not new, it's not unique, it's what we have allowed to happen. And I would say this, America and Western culture in general is really hung up on even numbers, like half a century and a century. I guarantee you, in 2070, there are going to be groups who are looking back 50 years since the pandemic, and they're going to be saying, what did we do? Because it's not on the people that were in charge in 1968 or at the end of the Civil War when Reconstruction was happening. We are literally at a tipping point, and this time it's on us. And so I would say that in thinking about this, don't make the mistake of thinking that having hope is what's going to cause people to take action. It's taking action that results in hope. And there are organizations that partner to put on this event that are doing work in this area. Chris and Carmen have described organizations that are doing work in this area. This is the time to say, I have to do more than listen and say, tisk, tisk. I have to do something. And that's the way that we will start to take a turn to a different path than the one that led us to mass incarceration.
Good point. And if you really value our democracy, you will take action so that we can have hope. Thank you very much, all of you, for your participation. We just really kind of skimmed the surface, but I think I'm glad we had this conversation. I'm going to thank you to everybody that was watching tonight. This is recording, being recorded, and it'll be on YouTube. So if you want to go back and watch a bit of it, and we'll also turn over the questions that we had submitted tonight to all of you, our participants, and hopefully you can provide us some answers after we finish this evening. And I'm going to turn it over to Allison Holcomb, and I appreciate ACLU Washington for the opportunity to moderate this conversation and the others that I had the opportunity to be involved in. And thank you to the panel. And Allison, it's yours.
We just had a quick note of gratitude for you, Enrique. You know, we began this series with you last fall, and these truly have proven to be some of the most vital, vibrant conversations about some of the most pressing issues of our time. So we just wanted to share that the ACLU of Washington is deeply grateful to all of the panelists and our partners who have brought these conversations to life, and especially to you, our host, Enrique Serna, for collaborating with us in developing and delivering these programs. Thank you all, and good night.